everyday claim for you. David phoned and said Socrates had just asked him to save the world.
David Icke, it must be, presumably.
It's David Owen.
David
surely,
Owen, yeah.
David Icke.
He went bonkers and predicted that Oxford United would get promotion.
Yes. He said Arsenal would do quite well in Europe as well, I think.
Yes. It's David Icke, the former Coventry goalkeeper, now son of God, one of the less publicised close-season transfers. To prove that he was the son of God, Icke announced that by the end of the year, Saddam Hussein would be dead and that the Isle of Arran would have been sunk beneath the waves under a gigantic earthquake. Well, unless there are some major surprises on tonight's news, it looks as if Socrates has been at the ouzo again. Clive, a salacious little number for you. If she's a tart, I'll give her the boot.
I'm not sure about this, but there was a story earlier on the year about Norman Lamont, who'd rented out his, a flat of his to somebody who'd advertised herself as relief masseurs or something.
Wasn't it Princess Diana? I got confused. I didn't know what...
I don't know if you ever managed to get rid of her or what terms they agreed for her departure.
Well, I'm not sure that she did ever leave, actually. It concerns the house.
You're saying she's still there? In Norman Lamont's house?
I'll give you the address if you'd like it.
How do you have the address, Clive?
How do I have the address?
Of where she is?
Well, if you go to the phone booth just outside here,
Yes,
there's quite a number of interesting addresses.
If I could just leap in here, it's concerns...
Happy Harry is the one I rather like.
I wouldn't bother.
I'm just rather shocked that you're so rude. I thought you're rather nice, man. You're rather vulgar, aren't you?
Yes, it turned out to be Miss Sarah Dale, who was alleged to be a prostitute, but who insisted she was a sex therapist who merely practiced in the nude, so as not to distract her clients. Must I always find that when I go to the dentist, so much less distracting if they're completely naked. Presumably now when Lamont goes home and finds a message that the chief whip called, he doesn't know whether to phone the House of Commons or pop downstairs.
He's just gabbling.
Harry, another deeply religious headline for you. God's cock goes with a rocket.
James Underton, is it?
All handicappers and all gamblers working at it.
Lined up and raring to go. They were away first time.
The trouble is that even the best worked-out systems can be rendered completely useless in a race like the 1967 Grand National.
Pop them down. Different class, the Foster, Lime King, Norther, Dunwoody, all went down. Watch the incredible pileup.
No system could have predicted the disastrous outcome of the race.
Out of the shambles, one horse appeared, complete with rider, Foinaven.
Or that a horse with odds of 100 to 1 would emerge the winner.
In all directions, some of them back the way they'd just come. That was the win that made it bookies' boom day and shattered the hopes of thousands.
This is Sandown Park. Most of these racegoers will place their bets on the basis of some real or imagined piece of knowledge about the horse. Some would claim to have a system. Frank George has been Professor of Cybernetics at Brunel University and is an expert on artificial intelligence. And he has a system.
If somebody invested £10,000 in my system in a year, on the average, they'd at least double it. But sometimes they make a great deal more than that, and sometimes they make less. Luck plays a major part, obviously, in these things. But on the whole, you do reasonably well.
His system asks the punter 9 sets of questions for each horse in the race. On, for example, recent form, the distance of the race, the going, and the jockey's weight. Points are awarded for each, according to statistical research on previous races. For instance, a horse will get a different number of points according to how much weight it's carrying, and whether it's more or less weight than it carried last time. All the points are then added up, and the horse with the highest score is the one to bet on in that particular race.
As far as I'm concerned, betting on my own system I don't do at all. But my younger daughter does. She uses it regularly. And she has had some very successful times, but nothing more sensationally so than 2 weeks ago when she won £15,000 in one afternoon using the system. That's most unusual. It may never happen again, but it was certainly the right day. Marvellous.
Bookmakers who think they're unbeatable smile at these sort of claims. Nicholas Correll is an unusual bookie. He's a member of the famous bookmaking family, but also a mathematician and fellow of the Institute of Mathematics.
Can a gambler make a profit? Well, I hope not. But obviously people will do. Your expert punter can sometimes, over a period of time, make it pay. And of course, your lucky punter will, for a small stake, perhaps win a large sum of money and will therefore always be on the right side of the book. The mass intelligence of the punter sometimes will put a lot of weight of money on a horse, which will then go to a false price. And because of that, the other prices of the horses will drift in the market, that is, get longer. And therefore, your professional or knowledgeable punter could take advantage that perhaps one of the other horses will be at a much higher price than it ought to be.
We asked Professor George to try his system on Nicholas Correll.
There's a particular sequential technique in statistics which suggests that there is a progression, perhaps from 5th to 4th to 3rd, ideally up to
Well, I
first
must
place.
admit, I'm a mathematician, but what you're saying doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever.
Well, you're not such a good mathematician as I thought you'd be in that case.
Well, that might well be true. But I think I would need a more mathematical explanation than you've given, which I think is just waffling on the whole. Unless you see those races and make your own opinions as to what instructions the jockey may or not be working under, it's totally impossible for you to make an accurate forecast that you can put into any form of mathematical formula to give a reasonably reliable rating.
I can't think of anything offhand that you could call scientific that wasn't included in my mode of thought. To say, therefore, it's unscientific seems to me slightly ill-informed.
Professor George is one of a long line of scientists and mathematicians who have tried to use their knowledge to win at gambling. In the 16th century, Cardano, a gambler and murderer, was the first to attempt a complete theory of games of chance. Then Galileo was asked by some gamblers to explain why in throws of 3 dice the number 10 appears more than the number 9. But it was in the 17th century that the mathematician Pascal, by studying gambling, established the theory of probability, which has now become a major branch of mathematics, a tool which scientists use to understand randomness. This mathematician even took a sabbatical to become a professional gambler in Las Vegas. He's Professor Ralph Abraham from the University of Southern California, who studies the role of probability in science.
Probability and statistics enter everywhere in the practice of science, particularly in the laboratory. Biological scientists, social scientists, their work is full of jargon from probability and statistics about the chi-square, the standard deviation, and so on. All of these concepts derive from the early interest of mathematicians in gambling.
In campuses all over the world, mathematicians talk about the finer points of
The
gambling.
thing is, the reason for not putting down 2 2s versus a deuce is you couldn't split one more time, whereas 2 3s versus a deuce, you could split that.
That's right, that would be 3
split
times.
3.
In the State University of California is a professor who is a world authority on gambling. Peter Griffin demonstrates the mathematics of losing at roulette.
Well, the first thing you want to look at when you're examining a gambling bet is the algebraic sign. The algebraic sign of the bet. The fact that this is a minus sign means that the money will, in the long run, flow toward the casino.
Despite this discouraging equation, Peter Griffin is prepared to venture from the calm halls of academia to the frantic palaces of Mammon to pit his brains against the inbuilt casino advantage. In roulette, the casino makes its money by adding zeros to the 36 numbers on the wheel. In Europe, by the way, they add only 1 0.
If there were just as many red frets as black frets, but no other frets on the wheel, then neither the house nor the player would have an advantage. And we wouldn't really get a long-term result, which is what's desired by the casinos. But as we see, the roulette wheel has 2 more frets,
In the United States, we have 2 zeros, both of them green. They're neither red nor black. And they work for the house. They do the work for the house so that a bet on red will win not 18 times out of 36, the 18 red against the 18 plus 18 black, but rather it will win 18 times out of 20, which is less than 1/2. That's the important fact.
If the casinos were fair, the payout rate with 38 frets should be 37 to 1. But with the zeros, it's only 35 to 1. So let's do an equation of what your chances are of winning at roulette. An equation, incidentally, which you could apply to any game. Let's say you put £1 on a number. You have a 1 in 38 chance of winning. If you win, you multiply that by £35 because the casino pays you at 35 to 1. But what if you lose? The probability is that you'll lose your bet 37 times out of 38. So you multiply that by the £1 you've lost. If we add these two together, we find that in the long run, you'll lose 5.26% of your money.
I walked along the one along with an independent air. Could hear the girls declare he must be a millionaire. Could hear them sigh and wish to dive and see them wink to the other eye. But the man who broke the back at Monte Carlo.
So, can you ever win at roulette? Here is a man who claimed he had an infallible system. He was a patent agent from London called Charles Wells. In 1891, Wells cleaned out the bank on 2 separate trips. In Monte Carlo, he became a legend and inspired countless other roulette systems players. Later, he was revealed as a fraud and a trickster and put in prison for 8 years. Wells admitted before he died that he'd never had a system at all. He was just plain lucky. More systems have been devised to beat the roulette wheel than any other game. The most famous of these is the Martindale system. In this, the player bets on one colour only and puts twice as much money on each succeeding bet until he wins, in order to recoup the money he's lost so far. If he wins, he'll get his money back plus £1. The trouble is, if he loses, doubling up his bet takes him very quickly into extremely large bets. If he's unlucky, he could either run out of money or hit the house limit, in which case he has lost everything. This might not happen very often, but when it does, he loses a lot. Here is another common system, an even simpler one. Wait for 8 reds to come up in a row and then start betting on blacks. Common sense tells the gambler that a black is now due because everybody knows that reds and blacks will even out eventually. So the gambler thinks he's making a really smart bet. But what do the mathematicians think about this strategy?
Suppose we have a perfect roulette wheel, whatever that is. Then the theorist is going to say this: after 8 reds in a row, there's 2 possible outcomes. One is 9 reds in a row, and the other is 8 reds followed by a black. And these 2 histories are equally likely. They're equally likely. So if you feel that common sense says, after 8 reds in a row, I must bet on a black, you're wrong. And if you do this a lot, you'll probably lose.
And people will lose because of a basic misconception about mathematical probability. So what is probability? If there are 38 numbers on the roulette wheel, we know the probability of any particular number winning is 1 in 38. And since there are an equal number of reds and blacks, disregarding the green zeros, of course, the probability of getting a red on the next turn of the wheel is 1 in 2. This applies even if there are 8 reds in a row, and this is what many people find so hard to believe.
And what I'm going to do is I'm going to toss the coin, and I want you to guess whether the coin has turned up heads or tails. We'll keep track of the results.
Professor Griffin is conducting an experiment on his students.
All of those, I want you to think about your guess, and then I want all of you who have guessed heads to raise your hand.
He's setting out to prove that most people do indeed believe that after a run of heads, you are more likely to get a tail.
4 have guessed tails. It was a head. It was a head, and so 13 were right, and 4 were wrong. But let's try again.
Each time, because Professor Griffin fixed it that way, the coin came up heads, and each time fewer students voted for heads on the next throw.
11 tails.
They've made a mistake, which is repeated in casinos all around the world. It's called the gambler's fallacy. The reason they're wrong is this. We know there's a 1 in 2 chance of getting heads on each toss. To find the probability of 8 heads in a row, we multiply 1 over 2 by itself 8 times. The probability of getting 9 heads in a row is therefore 1 in 512, even more unlikely. So unlikely you should now back a tail? Not at all. 8 heads followed by a tail is an equally unlikely sequence. In other words, you've an absolutely equal chance of a head or a tail after a run of 8 heads. Professor Griffin's students were obeying some intuitive but illogical sense of order.
Can the coin know anything? Can it know what it did last? You'd say no, that's foolish. If I said, well, do you think this coin has conscience? Does it care what it did last? Does it care? Does it care that it's been heads twice in a row and that it's being a little bit unfair? You'd say, no, that's nonsense. Of course not. If I asked the question that way, I think we'd get different results. But there is some suggestion that people will react to a sequence of consecutive occurrences of the same type by believing that the other result must compensate. The tails must somehow strive to catch up with the heads.
The punter who accepts that a red or a black is just as likely, even after a long run of reds, might still argue that during the evening, the reds and blacks are bound to even out in the end. He would be right, to a certain extent. Eventually, they will even out, but only gradually, and over a long period, not over just a few turns of the wheel. Still not convinced? We got a computer to simulate 709,920 turns of the roulette wheel. We looked for how many times the computer came up with 8 reds in a row. It was 359 times. We then looked to see what happened on the 9th turn of the wheel after every run of 8 reds. The mathematicians say there should be an almost equal proportion of reds and blacks. Most gamblers, however, would expect very few reds on the 9th turn. Here's the result of our test. On the 9th turn, a red came up 52% of the time. Black came up 48% of the time. So the mathematicians are right. The gambler's fallacy is indeed a fallacy. The Santa Fe Institute in New Mexico. If mathematics can't beat the roulette wheel, what about physics?
And you can make a real quick and dirty estimate of how much drag comes about as a result of air by just assuming that you've got a ball rolling along and there's a bunch of air out there. This is my idea of air, little blue dots. And what happens is as the ball rolls along, it hits these pieces of air, like these little molecules, and suppose they just bounce off sideways.
This is Professor Doan Farmer. As a young research student back in the early 1980s, he and a group of friends tried to devise a way of predicting where the ball will land on the roulette wheel.
There's a rotating rotor in the center, and second with this ball spinning on a smooth track. It's a bit like the planets going around the sun and another planet going around the opposite direction. Friction acts on the ball and slows it down. You can hear it slow down as it goes slower and slower, and finally at a certain point, centrifugal force stops acting and it falls onto the track and lands on one of the numbers. So, the idea is to try and predict this Newtonian, deterministic, dynamical system that's just obeying the laws of physics.
Newton was the founding father of classical physics. In 3 simple laws, he formulated the physics of motion. These laws applied to the smallest particle and to the largest planet. Because of Newton's work, scientists believed right up to the beginning of this century that the universe was like a vast clockwork mechanism running on a predetermined course, simply obeying the laws of physics.
Newton had an amazing insight that altered the course of history when he said that force equals mass times acceleration. Well, mass is a roulette ball. Acceleration, in this case, has to do with the fact that as the roulette ball goes around, the roulette ball is slowing down. Its velocity is changing. The question is, what's the force that's making that happen? The force in this case happens to be mainly air. Air creates drag. It's the same thing in your car. You're driving along, the air slows your car down, and you have to keep putting gas in there to keep it going. In this case, the air just slows the ball down, and that's what makes it change speed. Now, there's the other part of this, that once the ball leaves the track, you'll see that it comes down and often hits one of these things, and it's very difficult to predict whether it's going to hit one of these, whether it's going to sail just past it, whether it's going to bounce around in these cups, and that part definitely makes things more random. But it turns out that even though it bounces around on the cups and ricochets off the diamonds and so on and so forth, it doesn't do that so much that you still can't predict something.
The diamond studs mean that Farmer can only predict which eighth or octant of the wheel the ball will land in, and his calculations, based on, for example, the velocity of the ball and the rotor, are so complicated that even the most agile of minds can't cope.
I managed to do these calculations not in my head, but with a combination of my foot and a computer. In fact, the way I talk to my computer is by flipping this little switch here, and the way the computer talks to me is by vibrating these little spots here with different frequencies. Now, the casino isn't going to let me walk in and plunk my computer down, so normally this would be worn in a shoe. So we take a shoe, we'd hollow the bottom of the shoe out, and we'd plunk this down in there, put a nice covering over the top so my feet don't hurt too much, and then put my foot up on top of this, resting my toe on that switch there, and then as the ball goes by, I would actually click that switch with my toe. And to make a prediction, I first of all pick a center for my coordinates. So let's say take this point right here as the center of our universe. It determines where positions are going to be measured. And finally, I pick a reference point on the wheel, 0, for example, just because it's nice and green and easy to spot. And the basic idea is to measure the times for the ball to go around a revolution and use that to get the velocities. So, for example, I wait until the croupier throws the ball and he's moved his hand away, and I start clicking on the wheel, and the 0 goes past. Now it knows the velocity of the rotor, and now I start clicking on the ball. And from that, it measures the velocity of the ball, and when it thinks the ball's 3 revolutions from falling, it makes a prediction. For example, octant 4. I place my bets, and I wait, and I hope that it lands on one of the numbers. I bet on several numbers in octant 4, and I win.
Doan Farmer and his colleagues took the roulette computer, programmed with the Newtonian algorithms, to Las Vegas to make their fortunes. They calculated they had a 44% advantage over the casino, but things weren't quite as easy as they'd anticipated.
So we put switches in our shoes. We had a wire harness running with these switches up to a computer, which was on a sacroiliac belt under our armpit, which we kind of wore in the wrong place. Women had bras. And so there's a computer tacked off here, but back in those days you didn't have CMOS. These computers drew a hefty amount of power, so we had a big pack of NiCad batteries under the other armpit. And we also had a power on and off switch that later on we installed in our pocket, in part because we had several disasters where something pulled loose, something shorted out, one of the solenoids clamped, and our star woman bettor actually started smoking in the middle of the section. And she has a rather nasty-looking scar to show. In fact, she was smoking, but we were winning like hell at that point. She'd won about $300 in the last 5 minutes, and she wasn't about to leave. I had to actually give her the signal to get out of there. We thought it wouldn't work to have one person inputting all the data and making the bets at the same time, which, if you've ever been in a casino, you sit on these little chairs and you're supposed to sedately sip your cocktail. And in fact, most people don't even look at the roulette wheel. They just kind of have these dazed, moronic expressions on their faces, and they just sprinkle chips all over the table. And they typically do it well before the roulette wheel is spun. I mean, we, on the other hand, are sitting there like this, clicking away with our shoes, and then lunging to place bets on numbers that are in adjacent parts of the wheel, which we've carefully memorized around these patterns, so it's a little conspicuous. When we did this, this was completely legal. And the times that we went in there, the first thing they do actually is they get these really big, ugly pit bosses to come up and glare at you. Like, they come about 3 feet away and they just stare at you all the time. And it's really unpleasant. And, you know, you realize, you know you're being videotaped because there are these mirrors with cameras behind them up above. And you'll notice these people who look astonishingly normal coming right up next to you and kind of standing behind you all the time. Well, for one thing, they will sometimes just ask you to leave. We do not appreciate your business. And if you have any sense at that point, you say, oh, thank you very much. And you collect your chips up and you walk out the door.
The security systems were so efficient that Farmer decided he had to make the roulette computer even less conspicuous. But in the meantime, his attention was diverted to the science of chaos. He wanted to research into this new field, so he passed on the computer to his colleagues, receiving a share of their future winnings in return.
There are people out there right now using this kind of computer. For obvious reasons, I don't want to divulge too many details about that. But I get checks in the mail from time to time. And on one hand, it was just a lark, and it's a kind of a point of curiosity that it's actually possible to beat roulette this way. On the other hand, it's a manifestation, a very concrete manifestation of a phenomenon that's called sensitive dependence on initial conditions. What that means is that what happens in the future is critically dependent on teeny tiny things that happen right now. Like where the roulette ball ends up is very critically dependent on exactly the way the croupier spins the ball. So very small things can have a very large effect at some point in the future. Roulette, as one of the classic examples of randomness, of the thing that everybody said couldn't be beaten, by scaling this particular mountain, we demonstrated that the impregnable fortress of randomness could actually be penetrated with the right tools to exploit deterministic behavior.
The expert gambler wouldn't go near roulette. His choice would be blackjack, sometimes known as 21. The gambler who understands this game can reduce the casino's average profit margin to a tiny 0.5%. The object of the game is to get closer to 21 than the dealer without going over or going bust. Each player gets 2 cards face down. An ace is worth 1 or 11, as the player chooses. The royal cards are worth 10. Everything else is face value. The player can ask for more cards to take him closer to 21, but if he goes over 21, he loses his stake. At the end of the hand, each winner gets paid at even money, unless he gets a blackjack, an ace and a 10, in which case he gets paid here a bonus rate of £3 for 2 staked. The key to success, to beating the dealer, is calculating what cards remain in the deck. And in the 1960s, the world of blackjack was thrown into turmoil when a brilliant young mathematician worked out how to do just that. As a 28-year-old professor of mathematics, this man succeeded where many before him had failed. This is Ed Thorpe, the mathematician who invented the first ever gambling system which works. It's called card counting. He now lives in the largest house in Newport Beach, close to Los Angeles. His book, Beat the Dealer, showed how you can beat the casino at the game of blackjack. It became an immediate bestseller.
The object of card counting is to tell the player whether he's got the advantage or whether the casino has the advantage. And if the player has the advantage, then he makes a big bet. If the casino has the advantage, the player makes a small bet. So the player wins the majority of big bets, and he loses the majority of small bets, typically, but comes out ahead in the long run. Now, the way card counting works is mathematical and computer analysis shows you that big cards are good for the player if they're still in the deck, and little cards still in the deck are likely to be bad for the player. So card counting tries to keep track of whether the deck is rich in big cards or poor in big cards. And a typical system works like this. The count starts out at 0 with a full deck. Big cards are aces and tens. They make blackjacks, for example. Little cards are 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. They make busting hands for dealer or player. And 7, 8, and 9 are intermediate cards, and they tend to have a intermediate value in the game as far as goodness or badness. We count +1 every time a little card goes out because we like that, and we count -1 every time a big card goes out. So we'd start with a count of 0. We'd say to ourselves, still 0 because that's an intermediate card. +1 now because a small card went out. +2, another small card went out. The deck's getting more favorable. +2 still because that's an intermediate card. Now a big card went out, and we have to subtract 1, so we're back to +1. Still +1. Still +1. 1, 1, 1. Now we're back at 0. Now -1, the deck's going against us, so we bet small, maybe go get a drink. -2, -1, 0, 1, 2, deck's going favorable. 3, quite favorable now. 4, +4, we'd be making rather large bets at this point. And you just do that. You count down through the deck and bet big when it's favorable and small when it's not. And if you do that over and over, you find out that you tend to win in the long run.
It might seem simple, but in fact Thorpe did millions of calculations on a computer before he discovered that high cards left in the deck favor the player and low cards favor the casino. Thorpe decided to publish his findings.
I gave a talk at the American Mathematical Society annual meeting in Washington, D.C., and I told how, with a simple card counting strategy, you could, in theory, make $3,200 per 8-hour day. When I came to the meeting, I found my talk was packed, a mixture of academic types and people with sunglasses and white shoes. Then there were stories in the press across the country after that. I would guess that there were 10 or 20,000 phone calls and letters in the course of a few weeks. And since there was some skepticism and there was also a lot of sneering by the casinos, I finally decided to give it a trial.
Thorpe was bankrolled by two millionaires, Mr. X and Mr. Y. They put up $100,000 to test his system. The three men descended on the casinos of Nevada in 1961. The casinos laughed at this professor. One owner said, "When a lamb goes to the slaughter, the lamb might kill the butcher, but we always bet on the butcher."
When I first began to play, they thought that they couldn't be beaten and that something was amiss. Either they had an unlucky dealer or they ought to change the cards or whatever. There was one instance at Harvey's Wagon Wheel on the south shore of Lake Tahoe on my first trip with Mr. X and Mr. Y, in which we built up a pile of about $17,000 in winnings in about 2 hours. And as the winnings piled up and the chip trays kept getting cleaned out over and over, they would change dealers more and more often. They must have had 6 or 8 dealers go through there. And the pit boss was perspiring and the dealers were panicking. The casinos gave me a lot of trouble when I played. They harassed me in various ways. Had my drink struck a couple of times, got cheated sometimes, got asked to leave a number of times, or they shuffled up the cards on me. And I was the first person, the pioneer, doing all this.
Life was never the same again for casino managers.
Ed Thorpe was the father of card counting. I would guess made everybody aware that the possibilities of the game of 21 could be beaten, and it's done wonders for our business, I believe.
The casinos should indeed have been grateful to Ed Thorpe. Thousands of hopeful punters came to Las Vegas clutching his book, few clever enough to operate his system successfully. For counting is difficult. The professional card counter does more than just count the high and low cards played. The most effective counting system also requires you to calculate a balance of high cards to low left in the deck. The card counter divides the card count, here seen on the left, by an estimate of the proportion of the deck remaining, in this case, 1/4. This gives the true count, which is the most accurate indication of when the player has an advantage over the casino. You can see here how the deck is going against the player. The counter then has to memorize a series of tables like this, which tell him the best strategy for every conceivable situation. This table tells the counter when to hit, which means take another card, and when to stand, not to draw another card. Peter Griffin is considered the world's leading expert on blackjack. He explained that the reason blackjack is beatable is that you're dealing with a finite number of cards.
The difference between blackjack and a typical game like roulette, which is based upon no memory of the previous results, can be easily illustrated by looking at a deck of cards we have here. We have 36 cards. 18 of them are red and 18 are black. Now, suppose we deal these cards out one at a time and remove them from the remaining pack. When we began, there were 18 red and 18 black. So when we began, the chance of a card being black was 18 out of 36, or 1/2. As we remove, for example, the first several cards, which turn out to be red, the chance of a black card changes at every instant. Now I have 6 red cards. If I remove them and they're no longer available for play, then the chance that the next card is black is no longer the original 18 out of 36, or 50%, but it has become 18 out of 30, or 60%. An enormous difference in a game of gambling. The blackjack card counter takes advantage of this sort of possibility as it occurs in the game, and it occurs because of the removal from play of cards.
Frank Schipani, also known as the Godfather, was a successful card counter for many years. He was forced to retire after a book exposed his operations, and he now runs a restaurant consultancy business in San Francisco.
Most people don't make very much money. In fact, most people that take up the game, don't do enough homework, don't practice enough, so they end up losing a lot more to the casinos than they would have normally. And some make a decent living, and there's a handful that make a lot of money. Let me show you the type of money that I've made. There was one casino in Dieppe, France, that was the 8th largest casino in France, and we broke the casino. Each stack that you see there is about $5,000, and there's about $250,000 on the bed.
Eventually, Schipani and his team were making up to $100,000 a week, but he had to quit because the casinos were onto him. They know about card counting and don't want counters playing at their tables. Elaborate defenses exist in every casino. Games are filmed by hidden cameras. Known card counters find their photographs are published in a secret document called the Griffin Book, and they are then barred from entry. Pit bosses walk the floor, keeping their eyes open for anything suspicious.
It's very obvious that you are counting cards if you're betting small, 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 and then all of a sudden you make a real big bet. So you have to use a certain type of camouflage to cover that up. And there's a variety of ways of doing it. Some of them are very subtle. You just sneak your bet up, a little bit at a time. Or the method that we used most successfully was we had somebody else at the table making all the small bets. And when the deck became favorable, he would put his hand up on his chin like this, and that was a signal to someone else to come over to the table and start betting $500, $1,000, 3 hands at a time, and he would make all the big bets.
What we do in this hotel, if we spot a card counter, is we ask them, not to play 21 anymore. We tell them they're welcome to play any other games in the casino, but that one they're asked not to play.
But what if they persist?
If they persist in playing, then we remind them.
Back in 1960s, if they caught you card counting, they would bar you in different methods. Some of them would just tell you politely that they don't want your business, you're too good for them. On a few rare occasions, they might take you in a back room and rough you up. One of the foreign casinos ended up taking me for a ride in the middle of the night. I actually thought I was a dead man. The way it turned out, they just told me to get on the next plane, and fortunately I was still alive the following morning. But nowadays, these casinos are more huge corporations, and they don't want to take a chance of being sued. So most of the times they just bar you politely, and they'll buy you dinner, take you to the show, and sometimes they'll even allow you to play in the casino, but don't play blackjack. If you want to continue playing, you have to develop a disguise. This is one of the disguises that I used. This is my driver's license. You'll see that I've got a toupee on there and glasses and full beard. I was going by the name of Frank Fasano at the time. My real name is Frank Schapani. That's a false identity card, but it's legal to do so in the state of California.
The casinos have a number of methods to thwart professional card counters like Frank. The most effective is to shuffle up the deck every few hands. This destroys the player's running count. But the problem with this is that it slows the game down, and so the casino loses revenue from the tables. The casinos therefore have another defense, which is to deal from shoes containing up to 8 packs of cards. This is called a multi-deck game. The casinos believe it is much harder for the card counter to exploit these games because the effect of the removal of cards from play is diluted by the size of the remaining deck.
The multi-deck shoes did protect the casinos for a little while, but it didn't last long. In fact, I personally and my teams, we made more money off of multi-deck shoes than we did off a single deck. Mainly because the casinos didn't think the games were beatable at that particular time, because they was dealing out of 4 decks or 6 decks at a time. But it just made it easier for us to pull off an act on them.
A new technique is shuffle tracking. Shuffling is supposed to randomize the deck. In fact, most casino shuffles are not efficient enough to do that, a weakness which modern card counters exploit. In Oakland, California, lives a man who probably knows more than anyone what professional card counters get up to today. He is called Arnold Snyder, and he runs the Blackjack Forum, which is a communication channel and magazine for professional players.
If this was a 4-deck game, generally 3 of these decks would be dealt. The last deck they wouldn't deal. They would simply, pick them up and then shuffle. The card counter, who has been sitting at the table, can keep a count, and he can know what the count was on, say, the first deck, and he might say, well, this deck here had a count of +5, and he might know the count on the second deck was, say, -2, and he might know that this deck here was +8, and this deck here was whatever it would equal to come out to 0. And now these decks are stacked in a discard tray like this, and he might know now, well, this deck here is equal to 0. It's pretty much an even deck, but here we've got a +3 and a +5 and a -8. Well, when the dealer goes to shuffle, the dealer might take this one, put it on top, and start shuffling. Well, he already knows, aha, there's a +3 and a +5 getting shuffled together. Then the dealer sets that aside, and there's a -8 and a 0, and then he stacks those up. Well, the card counter knows the top half here is a 0 and a -8. The bottom half here is a +3 and a +5. They give him the cut card. He's going to cut. He'll cut this part right to the top. He's got a +3 and a +5 right up. He'll place a big bet right off the top. This doesn't look like a card counter.
Shuffle tracking definitely poses a threat. Our shuffle here is very difficult to track, so our vulnerability isn't as great. There are other shuffles that definitely poses a great problem.
So nowadays does the computer. The dealer can in effect be doing battle with a computer brought in to take over the burden of heavy mental arithmetic.
This is David. David plays relatively perfect blackjack. To me, this is a gorgeous piece of machinery because it works so beautifully. This is the computer. It's about the size of a pack of cigarettes, but thinner. This is the battery pack, on-off switch. Very simple device. There are a couple switches in each toe, and the switches are your way of telling the computer what cards you've seen, what hand you're holding, and what the dealer's up card are. There are a couple of buzzers in the bottom. They don't really make any noise when they buzz, but they tap the bottom of your foot, and they use a code to tell you whether or not you want to take another card or whether or not you want to stay with what you've got. It does what card counting can't do. It can allow them to play with a flat bet in single deck games without looking like a card counter, making weird plays that card counters wouldn't make because they actually have a lot more information to go on.
It's a lot tougher to spot the illegal use of computers in playing 21. One of the primary things we look for is any unusual movements about their body, be it with their feet and their shoes, or perhaps their hand on their thighs. There's several different ways to operate the computer, so that's the main way that we look, see if they're doing something unusual.
Players started getting caught with these computers when the computers started being sold through want ads and to a lot of inexperienced players that really didn't understand how difficult they were to use. And they would begin to learn how to use them, but ultimately what would happen is they'd be in their seat in a casino, and maybe at home they didn't notice it, but in a casino environment they're trying to play, and their feet, their toes are getting tired, they're getting fatigued, and they just start, they almost look like they're riding a bicycle while they're playing their hands. And it looks very suspicious, and anyone who's playing with $100 chips, $500 chips, is going to have a lot of eyes on them in a casino. And if this is the kind of stakes you're playing for, and you're sitting there like this, and you're winning lots of money, it doesn't take long before somebody comes and taps you on the shoulder and just says, hey buddy, let's get into the back room, we'd like to search you, find out what's going on.
Blackjack is therefore one casino game which can be beaten. The card counter can make around 1 to 2% profit of the total amount bet if he can fool the pit bosses. But it's hardly an easy way to make a living. The best game in town isn't found in the casino at all. Few people realize it, but if you throw darts into the Financial Times listings and buy shares randomly, on average and over the long term, you'll make an 11% profit. You won't have as much fun, but you have a very good chance of staying in the black.
Well, the big difference between the stock market and the roulette wheel, or indeed the race course, is that you will always come out in the black, in the sense that over time, the stock market always goes up. Hence, over longer periods of time, you end up winning. Of course, with the roulette wheel or the horse race, only one horse, one number can win. The stock market goes up over time, mainly because people's living standards, their wealth, the economic growth of the nation improves over time, and the stock market reflects that.
The American Ed Thorpe retired from blackjack in the 1960s and moved into the stock markets. Now he's a multimillionaire, and it was his stock market systems which made him rich.
I switched from blackjack to the stock market because I thought the stock market was the ideal gambling game to analyze, because it was quite a varied game. It had no limit to the upside as far as making money if one wanted to make money at it. And it also had important potential economic and social consequences. So I thought it would be fascinating to go into it. And I also thought that I'd meet a better class of people than I met in the gambling world.
Play 4th of July! Show 760!
The stock market has many similarities to a casino. First, think about the so-called investments that people make. And there's a chance element, just like there is in a casino. They put up money, and they get more or less money back after a period of time. And so you can think of their investments as bets. There are differences. One mathematical difference is that most of the casino gambling games are simple enough so you can analyze them and you can compute accurate probabilities. In Wall Street, in the financial world, we don't know what the probabilities are. We just have statistical estimates for them.
Thorpe's computers tell him where there are price discrepancies in different financial markets around the world. He then buys and sells with amazing speed to exploit these differences. He's been known to trade as much as $300 million in one day in a series of interlocking deals. He's found the ultimate gambling system, a method of playing the stock market with a minimum risk of losing. In his house is something that makes you realize a remarkable thing about Ed Thorpe. He isn't really a gambler at all.
You might think because of my interest in gambling games that I like to take risks, speculate, and I'm a gambler, but that's not true. I really try to do things to tip the odds in my favor and to reduce the risks. The money management system that I use in blackjack and the hedging and arbitrage system that I use in securities markets, for example, does that to as high a degree as I know how to do. And even this room here, this is an underground bomb shelter, earthquake-proof room, that sort of thing. It'll withstand a nuclear blast, 1 megaton blast, a mile away, we think, and you'd still survive. Or a major earthquake, as big an earthquake as we expect in California.
The message for most punters is that by all means have fun, but if you want to win, the last thing you want to do is gamble. Weigh the odds, assess the risk, that is, the actual probability of winning. If you can do that, you might be a winner.
The wheel of fortune.
So what's the best bet? If you look at it in terms of how much of gamblers' stakes never come back in winnings, on average, the football pools are worst, followed fairly closely by horse racing. You'll lose less at roulette, especially if you play in Europe. Amateur blackjack is slightly better. If you stick to red and black, European roulette isn't bad. Blackjack played by an expert, still better. But if you want to make a profit, you'll need to card count. Which leaves the stock market as your best bet. Not allowing for inflation, it's yielded an average 11% a year over the last 60 years.
I'm just a stupid gambler. I'm smart enough to know that I'm not going to win a bunch and go home with it. This place stays green, and it's my green that keeps it green. I know that.
Since January, I've won about $18,000. Yeah, but I probably put in about $19,000.